Detective James Rodriguez stepped off the plane at Chicago's busy airport, feeling the cool air hit his face. He pulled his black suit jacket tighter and checked his government phone for the third time. The screen showed several missed calls from his boss back in Washington. James had been a federal agent for 15 years, working on some of the toughest cases in the country. But this assignment was different. This time, he wasn't chasing criminals on the streets. He was here to catch corrupt cops. The Department of Justice had sent him to investigate something ugly happening at this airport. For months, complaints had been piling up on someone's desk in Washington. Black and brown travelers were being stopped, searched, and harassed for no good reason. Evidence was disappearing from cases. Officers with long histories of complaints somehow kept their badges and their jobs. Someone was protecting the bad cops, and James was here to find out who. His briefcase felt heavy in his hand. Inside were classified files that painted a disturbing picture. Photos of bruised suspects who claimed they never resisted arrest. Audio recordings of phone calls between officers talking about handling problems and making things go away. Financial records showing unexplained cash deposits in several officers' bank accounts. If even half of what he'd read was true, this place was rotten to the core. James walked through the busy terminal, watching people hurry past with their luggage and coffee cups. Families reunited with hugs and tears. Business travelers rushed to their next flights. Everyone seemed normal, going about their lives. But James knew that beneath this ordinary surface, something dark was happening. He noticed the security cameras mounted on every corner, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Good, he thought. Everything would be recorded. That would work in his favor when the time came to build cases against the corrupt officers. As he made his way toward baggage claim, James felt eyes on him. He'd developed a sixth sense for being watched during his years as an agent. Sure enough, when he glanced around, he spotted 3 airport police officers near the information desk. They weren't helping travelers or checking tickets. They were staring directly at him. The first officer was a big man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. His name tag read Morrison. James had seen that name in the files. Officer Jake Morrison had been with airport police for 20 years. In those 20 years, he'd received 47 complaints from travelers. 47 complaints about excessive force, racial slurs, and harassment. Yet somehow, Morrison had never been suspended, never been demoted, never faced any real consequences. The second officer was younger, maybe in his 30s. He kept looking back and forth between Morrison and James like he was waiting for instructions. The third officer had his hand resting on his radio, ready to call for backup at any moment. James felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this before in other cities, other airports, other police departments. The way certain officers sized up black men, looking for any excuse to flex their authority. The way they communicated with just looks and nods, like they were part of some secret club. He forced himself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't help the investigation. He needed to blend in, gather evidence, and build an airtight case. His cover story was simple. He was the insurance investigator from Denver, in town for business meetings. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that should attract attention from honest cops. But as James approached the baggage carousel, he realized these weren't honest cops watching him. Officer Morrison whispered something to his colleagues, then started walking in James's direction. The younger officer circled around to James's left, while the third officer stayed back but kept his eyes locked on the scene. James's phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. Hotel reservation confirmed. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Stay safe. He smiled slightly. By tomorrow morning, he'd be sitting down with the airport's chief of police, officially beginning the federal investigation. Chief Hayes had a reputation as one of the good ones, an officer who'd been fighting corruption from within. But even good chiefs had bad officers working under them, and sometimes those bad officers had powerful friends protecting them. The baggage carousel started moving, and James watched for his black suitcase. He'd packed light for this trip, just enough clothes for a week, his laptop, and some personal items. The real tools of his investigation were already here, waiting for him. Bank records, phone records, surveillance footage that had been secretly gathered over months of preparation. A young mother with two small children stood next to James at the carousel. One of her kids, a little girl maybe 5 years old, looked up at him with curious eyes. "Are you a police officer?" she asked innocently. James smiled down at her. "Something like that, sweetie." "My daddy says police officers help people," the little girl continued. "That's what we're supposed to do," James replied, glancing over at Morrison, who was now standing just 10 feet away. The little girl's mother apologized for her daughter's questions and gently pulled her away. James watched them go, thinking about all the families who'd been harmed by corrupt officers like Morrison, all the innocent people who'd been stopped, searched, and humiliated just because of the color of their skin. His suitcase finally appeared on the carousel. As he reached for it, James felt someone step up close behind him. "Excuse me, sir." James turned around to find Officer Morrison standing there, his chest puffed out with authority. Up close, James could see the man's bloodshot eyes and smell coffee on his breath. "Can I help you with something, officer?" James asked politely. Morrison looked him up and down slowly, like he was examining evidence at a crime scene. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. I'm going to need to see some identification." James felt his heart rate increase, slightly, but his face remained calm. He'd been in dangerous situations before. He'd faced down armed drug dealers and violent gang members. One racist airport cop didn't scare him. "What description would that be?" James asked. Morrison's eyes hardened. "Just show me your ID and we can clear this up quickly." James knew his rights. He knew that Morrison had no legal authority to demand identification without reasonable suspicion of a crime, but he also knew that arguing with a corrupt cop in public could escalate the situation beyond his control. The other passengers at baggage claim were starting to notice the confrontation. Some pretended not to see what was happening, focusing intently on their phones or luggage. Others stared openly, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Of course, officer," James said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. "I'm happy to cooperate." He pulled out his wallet and removed his driver's license. Not his federal credentials, not yet. Those would stay hidden until absolutely necessary. Revealing his true identity too early could blow the entire investigation. Morrison took the license and examined it like he was checking for forgeries. "Denver, Colorado," he read aloud. "What brings you to Chicago, Mr. Rodriguez?" James supplied. "Business trip. I work for an insurance company." "Insurance, huh?" Morrison's tone was skeptical. "What kind of insurance?" James had rehearsed this cover story dozens of times. "Property and casualty. We're looking into some claims in the Chicago area." The younger officer had moved closer during their conversation. James could see the man's name tag now. Wilson. According to the files, Officer Wilson was Morrison's partner and had been involved in several questionable incidents over the past year. "You carrying any weapons, Mr. Rodriguez?" Wilson asked. James shook his head. "No, sir." "Mind if we search your bag?" Now they were crossing into clearly illegal territory. James had committed no crime, shown no suspicious behavior, and given them no reason to search his belongings. Any evidence they found in an illegal search would be thrown out of court. But James also knew that refusing the search might escalate the situation. Morrison and Wilson were clearly looking for a confrontation, and James couldn't afford to give them what they wanted. "I'd prefer if you didn't," James said calmly. "I have confidential client files in there." Morrison stepped closer, invading James's personal space. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, friend. Your choice." The threat was clear. James looked around the baggage claim area, noting the positions of security cameras, counting the number of witnesses, calculating his options. Everything was being recorded. Every word, every action, every violation of his constitutional rights. Perfect. James realized that Morrison and Wilson were about to give him exactly what he needed: undeniable evidence of corruption, caught on camera, witnessed by dozens of innocent travelers. "I understand, officer," James said, his voice steady and respectful. "I'm happy to cooperate with whatever you need to do." Morrison smiled. but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of a man who thought he held all the power, who believed he could treat people however he wanted without consequences. James smiled back, knowing something Morrison didn't. Every moment of this encounter was providing evidence. For the federal case that would eventually destroy Morrison's career and send him to prison, the investigation was about to begin, and Morrison had just made James's job much easier. As more officers appeared from different parts of the terminal, James prepared himself for what was coming next. He thought about all the innocent people who'd been through this. The tension in the baggage claim area was thick enough to cut with a knife. More travelers had started to notice what was happening, but most quickly looked away when Officer Morrison glared in their direction. James could feel the familiar weight of injustice pressing down on him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over here," Morrison said, pointing toward a corner away from the main crowd. His hand rested on his radio, ready to call for more backup if needed. James picked up his suitcase and followed, knowing that every step was being recorded by the airport's security cameras. He'd studied the camera layout during his preparation for this assignment. There were at least 6 different angles capturing this encounter, plus whatever cell phone videos nervous travelers might be secretly recording. Officer Wilson flanked James on his left side, while Morrison took the lead. A third officer, whose name tag read Stevens, appeared from nowhere to block any potential escape routes. James almost laughed at their tactical formation. They were treating him like a dangerous criminal when all he'd done was collect his luggage while being black in an airport. "Put the suitcase down and step back," Morrison ordered when they reached the corner. James complied, placing his black suitcase on the floor and taking 2 steps back. He kept his hands visible at all times, knowing that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted or deliberately twisted to justify whatever Morrison had planned. "Now, Mr. Rodriguez," Morrison said, his voice dripping with false authority, "we've had reports of a man matching your description involved in suspicious activities. Dark skin, business suit, about your height and weight." James had heard this line before in other cities, other investigations. It was police code for, "We're profiling you because of your race, but we need a legal excuse." "What kind of suspicious activities?" James asked. "The kind that could get you in serious trouble," Wilson interjected, "so I suggest you cooperate fully." A young black woman with a laptop bag slung over her shoulder had stopped about 20 feet away, pretending to look at her phone while actually watching the confrontation. James caught her eye for just a moment and saw the recognition there. She knew exactly what was happening because she'd probably experienced it herself. "Officers, I've shown you my identification," James said, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I've answered your questions. I'm not sure what else you need from me." Morrison's jaw tightened. "What I need is for you to lose the attitude and show some respect." "I apologize if I seem disrespectful," James replied. "That wasn't my intention." But Morrison had already decided how this encounter was going to end. James could see it in the man's eyes, the same look he'd seen on corrupt cops in Detroit, Atlanta, and Phoenix. It was the look of someone who enjoyed having power over other people, and wasn't going to let facts or laws get in the way of exercising that power. "Turn around and put your hands on the wall," Morrison commanded. "Am I under arrest?" James asked. "You're being detained for investigation." "Investigation of what crime?" Morrison's face reddened. "Don't get smart with me, boy." The racial slur hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several nearby travelers heard it clearly, and James saw at least 2 people raise their phones to start recording. Perfect. Now Morrison's true nature was on full display for everyone to see. James turned toward the wall as ordered, placing his palms flat against the cold concrete. He'd been through countless searches during his career, both as an agent conducting them and as a black man being subjected to them. But this felt different. This time, he was the bait in his own trap. Morrison's hands were rough and invasive as he patted down James's jacket, pants, and shoes. "What's this?" he asked, finding James's federal credentials in an inside pocket. James's heart rate spiked. He'd hoped to avoid revealing his identity until much later in the investigation, but Morrison had forced his hand. "My work identification," James said simply. Morrison pulled out the leather credential case and flipped it open. His face went pale as he read the words federal agent and saw James's official photograph. "This is fake," Morrison announced loudly, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "I can assure you it's not," James replied, still facing the wall. Wilson leaned over to look at the credentials. "Looks real to me, Jake." "Fake IDs can look real, that's the whole point," Morrison snapped. But he was studying the credentials more carefully now, running his finger over the official seal, checking the holographic security features that would be impossible to counterfeit. James could hear Morrison's breathing getting heavier behind him. The officer was starting to realize he might have made a terrible mistake, but his pride and prejudice wouldn't let him back down. "Even if this is real," Morrison said, "federal agents aren't above the law. You could still be involved in criminal activity." It was a desperate attempt to justify his actions, and everyone within earshot knew it. James turned around slowly to face Morrison, making sure to move in a non-threatening manner. "Officer Morrison," he said quietly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding here." "The only misunderstanding," Morrison shot back, "is you thinking your fancy badge makes you special." More officers had arrived during their conversation. James counted at least 5 now, all watching their interaction with Morrison. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were seeing. Others seemed eager for whatever was about to happen next. An elderly white businessman with expensive luggage had stopped to watch the confrontation from about 30 feet away. When Morrison noticed him staring, the officer barked, "Move along, nothing to see here." The businessman hesitated. "Actually, I think I should stay. This gentleman seems to be experiencing some kind of problem." "Sir, I'm going to ask you to move along before you become part of the problem," Wilson warned. But the businessman didn't budge. "I'm a retired judge," he said firmly, "and what I'm seeing here doesn't look right." James felt a surge of gratitude toward the stranger. In his experience, most people walked away from confrontations like this not wanting to get involved, but occasionally, someone with courage and a conscience would step forward. Morrison's radio crackled to life. "Morrison, what's your status? We've got reports of a disturbance at baggage claim." The officer grabbed his radio. "Everything's under control, just a routine stop." "Routine, my foot," the retired judge muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Morrison was getting backed into a corner, and dangerous men like him were most unpredictable when they felt trapped. James could see the calculation going on behind Morrison's eyes. The officer had already committed to this course of action, had already humiliated himself in front of his colleagues and the public. Backing down now would make him look weak. "Sir, you need to come with us for additional questioning," Morrison announced. "Am I under arrest?" James asked again. "You're being detained." "For what specific crime?" Morrison paused, searching for a legal justification that didn't exist. "Suspicious behavior and possible document fraud." James almost smiled. Morrison was digging himself deeper with every word. The federal credentials were obviously authentic, and suspicious behavior consisting of collecting luggage while black wouldn't hold up in any court. "I'd like to call my supervisor," James said. "You can make your phone call after we're finished with our investigation," Morrison replied. The retired judge stepped closer. "Officer, I've been watching this entire interaction, and I haven't seen this man do anything that could reasonably be considered suspicious." "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to move along," Morrison warned. "And I'm going to politely decline," the judge replied. "This man has the right to legal representation, and he has the right to not be harassed because of his race." Morrison's face turned bright red. Nobody's being harassed because of their race. "Then what exactly is he being detained for?" the judge pressed. Morrison looked around at the growing crowd of witnesses, the security cameras, his fellow officers who were starting to look uncomfortable with the situation. He was trapped, and James could see the exact moment when Morrison decided to escalate rather than retreat. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Morrison ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. "On what charge?" James asked. "Resisting arrest." "I haven't resisted anything." "You're resisting now," Morrison said, grabbing James's wrist and forcing it behind his back. The handcuffs were cold and tight against James's skin. He could hear gasps from the crowd of onlookers as Morrison roughly secured his hands. The retired judge was speaking urgently into his own phone, probably calling a lawyer or the media. The young black woman James had noticed earlier was now openly recording the arrest with her phone. When Wilson moved toward her, she stepped back, but kept filming. "You can't stop me from recording in a public place," she said loudly. "We'll see about that," Wilson muttered, but he didn't try to take her phone. As Morrison led James away in handcuffs, the federal agent caught sight of his reflection in a storefront window. He looked like just another black man being arrested for nothing, another victim of a system that saw his skin color as proof of guilt, but appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes the victim was actually the hunter, and sometimes the hunter was walking straight into a carefully prepared trap. James's supervisor would be very interested to hear about this encounter. So would the Department of Justice attorneys who were preparing civil rights. The airport police station was smaller than James had expected, tucked away behind the main terminal where most travelers would never see it. Morrison pushed him through a heavy metal door past a front desk where a bored-looking sergeant barely glanced up from his paperwork. "Processing a detainee," Morrison announced. "Suspicious behavior and document fraud." The desk sergeant, whose nameplate read Thompson, finally looked up. His eyes widened slightly when he saw James in handcuffs, still wearing his expensive business suit. "Document fraud?" Thompson asked. "What kind of documents?" Morrison tossed James's federal credentials onto the desk like they were fake drivers. Licenses bought online. Claims to be a federal agent. Obviously counterfeit. Thompson picked up the credential case and examined it carefully. Unlike Morrison, he seemed to understand what he was looking at. The holographic seals, the special paper, the magnetic strip on the back. These weren't things you could fake at a local print shop. "Jake," Thompson said quietly, "these look real to me." "Course they look real," Morrison snapped. "That's how good forgeries work nowadays. Run his fingerprints, you'll see I'm right." James stood silently as they debated his identity, storing every detail in his memory. Thompson's hesitation suggested there might be honest officers in this department after all. Morrison's desperate insistence that the credentials were fake showed how deep his commitment to this mistake had become. "Sir," Thompson addressed James directly, "I'm going to need you to empty your pockets onto this tray." James nodded toward his handcuffed wrists. "Kind of difficult to do that right now." Thompson shot Morrison a look. "Take the cuffs off." "He's not going anywhere and he's been cooperative so far." "He was resisting arrest," Morrison protested. "What I saw was you arresting a man who was asking reasonable questions about why he was being detained," said a familiar voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see the retired judge who'd witnessed the confrontation at baggage claim. He'd followed them to the police station, still carrying his own luggage. "Sir, you can't be back here," Thompson said. "Actually, I can," the judge replied, showing his retired judicial identification. "Judge Robert Mason, Cook County Circuit Court, retired. I witnessed what happened out there, and I'm prepared to testify that this arrest appears to be completely without legal justification." Morrison's face went white. Bad enough to arrest an innocent man, worse to do it in front of witnesses, but having a retired judge as a witness was catastrophic. "Your Honor," Thompson said respectfully, "we're just processing a routine detention." "Routine?" Judge Mason raised his eyebrows. "I heard Officer Morrison use racial slurs and threaten this man for asking about his legal rights. There was nothing routine about it." James felt the handcuffs being removed from his wrists. Thompson was clearly trying to defuse the situation before it got worse. "Empty your pockets, please," Thompson said gently. James complied, placing his wallet, phone, keys, and a small notepad on the plastic tray. Thompson examined each item carefully, looking for anything that might justify Morrison's actions. "Mr. Rodriguez," Thompson said, reading from James's driver's license. "What brings you to Chicago?" "Business meeting," James replied. "I work for an insurance company." It wasn't technically a lie. The Department of Justice could be considered an insurance company of sorts, ensuring that citizens' rights were protected. And these federal credentials? James looked directly at Morrison. Are completely authentic. You can verify them with the Department of Justice if you'd like. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Verifying the credentials would prove he'd arrested a real federal agent, which would raise uncomfortable questions about his motivations and judgment. We'll handle the verification process, Thompson said. In the meantime, you'll need to stay here while we sort this out. Judge Mason stepped forward. Sergeant, this man has been cooperative throughout this entire ordeal. Officer Morrison had no reasonable suspicion to detain him, no probable cause to arrest him, and I personally heard him use inappropriate language during the encounter. Unless you can articulate specific criminal charges, you need to release him immediately. Thompson looked back and forth between Morrison and the judge, clearly caught in the middle of a bad situation. James could see the man calculating the political implications of each decision. Jake, Thompson said quietly to Morrison, maybe we should call Chief Hayes about this. Don't call the chief, Morrison said quickly. I can handle this. No, said another voice from the doorway. I think calling Chief Hayes is exactly what we should do. A woman in a sharp business suit stepped into the room, showing her own government identification. Agent Lisa Chen, Department of Justice. I believe you have my colleague in custody. James felt relief flood through him. Chen was his supervisor, the agent who'd been coordinating this investigation from Washington. Her arrival meant the cover operation was officially blown, but it also meant he was about to be freed. Morrison stared at Chen's credentials like they were written in a foreign language. Another fake federal agent? He asked weakly. Sergeant Thompson, Chen said, ignoring Morrison completely. I need Agent Rodriguez released immediately. He's part of an ongoing federal investigation, and his detention is interfering with official government business. Thompson's eyes went wide. Federal investigation? Into what? Chen smiled coldly. Into allegations of corruption, civil rights violations, and abuse of authority within this department. The silence in the small room was deafening. Morrison looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Thompson's face went pale as he realized the implications. Judge Mason nodded with grim satisfaction. You mean, Thompson said slowly, we just arrested the federal agent who's investigating us? That's exactly what you did, Chen confirmed. And you did it in front of multiple witnesses and security cameras after using racial slurs and denying him his constitutional rights. Morrison sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. This can't be happening. Oh, but it is happening, Judge Mason said cheerfully, and I have it all on video. He held up his phone, showing a recording of the confrontation. James cleared his throat. Sergeant Thompson, during my time in your holding area, I couldn't help but overhear some interesting conversations between officers, discussions about evidence management, case dispositions, and certain financial arrangements. Thompson's face went from pale to green. What kind of discussions? The kind that federal prosecutors find very interesting, James replied. Chen opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. We've been monitoring communications and financial records for several officers in this department for the past 6 months. Agent Rodriguez was here to begin the formal investigation phase, but thanks to Officer Morrison's actions, we now have additional charges to consider. What kind of charges? Thompson asked, though he clearly didn't want to hear the answer. Civil rights violations under color of law, conspiracy to deny constitutional rights, and potentially racketeering charges if we can prove organized corruption, Chen listed. The penalties range from fines and job loss to federal prison time. Morrison looked up from his hands. I want a lawyer. That's probably a good idea, Judge Mason commented. You're going to need a very good lawyer. Chen turned to Thompson. Sergeant, I need all paperwork related to Agent Rodriguez's arrest sealed and preserved as evidence. Any attempt to alter or destroy records will be considered obstruction of justice. Yes, ma'am, Thompson replied quickly. I also need a private room where Agent Rodriguez and I can discuss the next phase of our investigation. James watched as Thompson frantically cleared an office for their use. The man was clearly trying to distance himself from Morrison's actions and cooperate with the federal investigation. As they settled into the borrowed office, Chen looked at James with a mix of concern and amusement. Well, that didn't go according to plan. Actually, James said, it went better than I could have hoped. Morrison just provided us with everything we need to destroy his credibility and prove a pattern of racial bias. The video evidence is certainly compelling, Chen agreed. Judge Mason has already agreed to testify and several other witnesses have come forward. James pulled out his phone and checked his messages. Look at this, he said, showing Chen his screen. The young woman who was recording posted the video on social media. It's already been shared thousands of times. Chen watched the video, shaking her head. Morrison using racial slurs, denying your rights, arresting you without cause. It's like a training film for how not to be a police officer. What happens now? James asked. Now we accelerate our timeline, Chen replied. Morrison's actions have created a public incident that we can't ignore. We'll need to coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office to fast-track the prosecution. Through the office window, James could see Morrison sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. Other officers were giving him a wide berth, clearly not wanting to be associated with whatever was coming next. He has no idea what's about to hit him, James observed. None of them do, Chen replied. But they're about to learn that actions have consequences, especially when those actions violate people's constitutional rights. A knock on the office door interrupted their conversation. Thompson peered him. Chief Robert Hayes arrived at the airport police station like a storm rolling in from Lake Michigan. James could hear his heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway before the man even appeared in the doorway. Hayes was a big man, built like the football player he'd been in college 30 years ago. But his eyes showed intelligence and frustration, rather than the blind aggression James had seen from Morrison. Agent Chen, Agent Rodriguez, Hayes said, nodding respectfully to each of them. I came as soon as I heard what happened. I'm deeply embarrassed by my department's actions today. Chen closed the case file she'd been reviewing. Chief Hayes, we appreciate your cooperation. This incident has certainly accelerated our timeline. Hayes sank into the remaining chair in the small office, looking older than his 55 years. I've been fighting corruption in this department for 3 years, ever since I took over as chief. Every time I think I'm making progress, something like this happens. James studied the chief's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agendas, but Hayes seemed genuinely upset about Morrison's actions, not just concerned about political damage control. How much did you know about Officer Morrison's behavior? James asked. Hayes rubbed his temples. Too much and not enough. I knew he had complaints in his file, but every time I tried to investigate, the paperwork would disappear, or witnesses would suddenly change their stories. It's like he had some kind of protection I couldn't identify. What kind of protection? Chen pressed. That's what I've been trying to figure out, Hayes replied. Morrison isn't smart enough to cover his tracks this well on his own. Someone higher up the food chain has been helping him. James and Chen exchanged glances. This matched their intelligence from Washington. The corruption at this airport wasn't just about individual bad cops. It was about a network of people working together to protect each other. Chief, James said, during my brief time in your holding area, I overheard some interesting conversations between officers. They weren't being careful about who might be listening. Hayes leaned forward. What kind of conversations? Officers, talking about cleaning up messes and making problems disappear. One mentioned something about monthly payments for keeping quiet about certain incidents. Hayes's jaw tightened. Which officers? James pulled out his notepad where he'd quickly written down everything he'd heard. Wilson, Stevens, and 2 others I couldn't identify by name. They seemed to think Morrison's arrest of me was just another problem they could make go away. That's not going to happen this time, Hayes said firmly. Not with federal agents involved and video evidence everywhere. Through the office window, James could see the local news vans starting to arrive in the airport parking lot. The story was spreading beyond social media now, reaching traditional media outlets that would give it even wider coverage. Chen's phone buzzed with a call. She glanced at the screen and stood up. I need to take this. It's the U.S. Attorney's office. While Chen stepped into the hallway for her call, Hayes turned to James with a worried expression. Agent Rodriguez, I need you to know that not everyone in this department is like Morrison. I've got good officers who've been trying to do the right thing despite the corruption around them. James nodded. I understand, Chief. Our investigation has always focused on identifying both the corrupt officers and the honest ones who might become allies in cleaning up the department. What can I do to help? Hayes asked. First, we need Morrison and his closest associates suspended immediately. They can't be allowed to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. Done, Hayes replied, without hesitation. Second, we need access to all personnel files, complaint records, and financial disclosures for every officer in the department. Hayes hesitated. That's going to require a federal warrant. Agent Chen is working on that right now, James assured him. Chen returned from her phone call looking grim. The U.S. Attorney wants to move fast on this. They're preparing federal charges against Morrison for violating civil rights under color of law. If convicted, he's looking at up to 10 years in federal prison. Hayes whistled low. 10 years? That's just for today's incident, Chen continued. If we can prove a pattern of behavior or if we find evidence of the broader corruption network, the charges could be much more severe. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Sergeant Thompson peered in, looking nervous. Chief, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've got a problem. Officer Morrison is requesting to speak with his union representative, and he's demanding that all video evidence from today be preserved under union guidelines. Hayes stood up abruptly. His union representative? Yes, sir. And there's more. Word is spreading through the department about the federal investigation. Some officers are talking about calling in sick tomorrow. Others are asking about early retirement options. Chen frowned. Sounds like people are panicking. Chief Hayes, James said, we need to act quickly before evidence starts disappearing. In our experience, once corrupt officers know they're being investigated, they'll do everything possible to cover their tracks. Hayes nodded grimly. What do you need? Lock down all computer systems tonight. No one accesses personnel files, complaint databases, or financial records without federal oversight. Post guards on evidence storage areas, and suspend anyone who shows up on our preliminary list of suspects. How many people are we talking about? Hayes asked. Chen opened another file from her briefcase. Based on our 6 months of investigation, we have credible evidence of corruption involving at least 12 officers, 3 sergeants, and 2 lieutenants. Hayes's face went pale. That's almost a quarter of my department. We know this is difficult, James said sympathetically. But the good news is that 3/4 of your officers appear to be honest, hard-working people who want to do their jobs properly. Thompson cleared his throat. Chief, there's something else. That retired judge who witnessed the arrest? He's outside talking to reporters. And the woman who filmed everything? She's giving interviews too. Through the window, James could see the growing media circus in the parking lot. Television reporters were setting up their equipment and more cars were arriving every few minutes. Hayes sighed heavily. This is going to be a nightmare for the airport's public relations. Maybe, Chen said, but it's also going to be a wake-up call. Sometimes institutions need public pressure to force necessary changes. James's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly and looked up with a slight smile. Chief, you might be interested to know that we've already received calls from 3 officers in your department who want to cooperate with the federal investigation. Who? Hayes asked. I can't reveal names yet, but they're offering to testify about corruption they've witnessed. Apparently, today's incident convinced them that staying silent isn't an option anymore. Hayes looked relieved for the first time since arriving. At least some of my people are doing the right thing. Chen's phone rang again. She answered quickly, listened for a moment, then hung up with a satisfied expression. That was Federal Judge Martinez, she announced. She signed warrants for Morrison, Wilson, Stevens, and 4 other officers. We'll be making arrests first thing tomorrow morning. Arrests? Thompson asked from the doorway. He'd been listening to the entire conversation. Federal arrests, Chen confirmed. For civil rights violations, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. This investigation is moving into its final phase. James watched Hayes process this information. The chief was clearly struggling with the reality that several of his officers would soon be federal prisoners, but he also seemed relieved that the corruption would finally be exposed and dealt with. "Chief," James said gently, "I know this is hard, but in my experience, departments that go through this process usually come out stronger and more professional on the other side." Hayes nodded slowly. "I've been trying to clean house for 3 years, but I couldn't do it alone. Maybe having federal oversight will finally give me the tools I need." Outside, the media circus was growing larger. James could see at least 5 television news trucks now, with reporters interviewing anyone who would talk to them about the incident. "The story's going national," Chen observed, watching the scene through the window. "Good," James replied. "Public attention will make it harder for anyone to cover this up or make it disappear." Morrison's voice could be heard in the main office area, arguing loudly with someone on the phone. He was clearly starting to understand the severity of his situation. "Chief Hayes," Chen said, "we're going to need secure facilities to conduct interviews with potential witnesses and suspects. Can you provide that?" "Whatever you need," Hayes replied. "I want this corruption eliminated from my department no matter what it takes." As evening approached, James reflected on how dramatically the day had changed. He'd arrived at the airport as an undercover investigator, hoping to gradually build a case against corrupt officers. Instead, he'd become the victim of the very corruption he was investigating, providing prosecutors with ironclad evidence of civil rights violations. Morrison had thought he was arresting just another black man he could intimidate and abuse. Instead, he'd arrested the federal agent who would destroy his career and send him to prison. Sometimes justice worked in mysterious ways, but it always found a way to work. 6 months later, James stood in a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, watching as Officer Jake Morrison was led away in handcuffs. The jury had taken less than 4 hours to find Morrison guilty on all counts: violating civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to deny constitutional rights, and obstruction of justice. The judge had just sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison. Morrison's wife was crying in the back of the courtroom. James felt a pang of sympathy for her and their children, who were innocent victims of Morrison's choices. But he also thought about all the travelers who'd been harassed, humiliated, and violated by Morrison over his 20-year career. Those victims deserve justice too. "One down, 11 to go," Agent Chen whispered as they watched Morrison being escorted out of the courtroom. The federal investigation had moved quickly after that day at the airport. Within a week, they'd arrested 12 officers, 3 sergeants, and 2 lieutenants. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing suspicious cash deposits, recorded phone conversations discussing cover-ups, and testimony from honest officers who'd finally found the courage to speak up. But Morrison's case had been the most important because it was the most public. The video of his racist attack on James had been viewed millions of times online, sparking national conversations about police accountability and racial profiling. When Morrison was convicted, it sent a message that no officer was above the law, no matter how long they'd gotten away with corruption. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around James and Chen as they walked down the stone steps. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward their faces. "Agent Rodriguez," called out a reporter from Channel 7 News. "How do you feel about Morrison's conviction?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm satisfied that justice was served, but this case was never about me personally. It was about protecting the constitutional rights of all travelers, regardless of their race or background." "Do you believe this conviction will deter other corrupt officers?" asked another reporter. "I hope so," James replied. "But more importantly, I hope it encourages honest officers to speak up when they see misconduct. Silence in the face of corruption makes everyone complicit." Chen stepped forward. "The Department of Justice remains committed to investigating civil rights violations wherever they occur. We want law enforcement officers and the public to know that we take these cases seriously." As they made their way to their car, James's phone buzzed with a text message from Chief Hayes. Morrison convicted, department morale improving, reforms working. Thank you. The reforms had indeed been dramatic. After the arrests, the airport, police department had been placed under federal oversight. New policies required body cameras for all officers, mandatory bias training every 6 months, and an independent civilian review board to investigate complaints. Most importantly, the department had hired Dr. Angela Washington, a former federal prosecutor, as their new director of professional standards. Her job was to root out any remaining corruption and prevent future problems. She'd already fired 3 more officers who'd tried to cover up their involvement in the corruption network. James drove Chen to the airport for her flight back to Washington. As they passed through the same terminal where Morrison had attacked him 6 months earlier, James noticed the changes. Officers were more professional in their interactions with travelers. The complaint box that had been hidden behind a pillar was now prominently displayed near the security checkpoint. Signs in multiple languages explained travelers' rights during police encounters. "Look at that," Chen said, pointing to a group of young officers talking respectfully with an elderly black gentleman who seemed to have questions about his connecting flight. 6 months ago, that same man might have been harassed and searched for no reason, James observed. Progress, Chen agreed. At her departure gate, Chen turned to James with a serious expression. "You know this isn't over, right? We've cleaned up this airport, but there are corrupt departments all over the country that need the same treatment." James nodded. "I know. Where to next?" "Phoenix Sky Harbor. We've got reports of systematic profiling of Hispanic travelers. Similar pattern to what we found here. When do I leave?" "Next week." "But James," Chen paused, "after what happened here, you don't have to go undercover anymore. We can send you in openly as a federal investigator." James considered this for a moment. Going in openly would be safer and less stressful. But it would also be less effective. Corrupt officers behaved differently when they knew they were being watched by federal agents. "I appreciate the offer," James said finally, "but undercover work gets better results. People show their true nature when they think no one important is watching." Chen smiled. "I figured you'd say that. Just promise me you'll be more careful in Phoenix." "I'll try," James laughed. "But sometimes these corrupt cops make it easy for us by being so obviously corrupt." As Chen boarded her plane, James walked back through the terminal, observing the daily operations of the airport police department. 6 months ago, this place had been a nightmare for black and brown travelers. Today, it was starting to look like what an airport police department should be. He stopped at the spot where Morrison had first approached him, where this whole investigation had begun. A plaque on the wall caught his attention, something that hadn't been there before. It read, "This airport is committed to treating all travelers with dignity and respect, regardless of race, religion, or national origin." A small victory, but an important one. James's phone rang. It was Chief Hayes. "Agent Rodriguez, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did here. I know it wasn't easy being arrested and humiliated like that, but your sacrifice helped save this department." "It was my job, Chief. How are things going with the reforms?" "Better than I expected," Hayes replied. "We've had 0 complaints about racial profiling in the past 3 months. Officer morale is actually up because the good cops don't have to worry about the bad cops making them all look terrible." "And the community response?" "Positive. We've started doing regular town halls with community leaders, and we're getting constructive feedback instead of just complaints. It's like we're actually part of the community now, instead of occupying it." James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why he'd become a federal agent in the first place. To protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to stand up to bullies with badges, to make sure the system worked for everyone. "Chief, I have to ask, did you know Morrison was this corrupt when you hired me to investigate?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "I suspected he was bad, but I had no idea how bad. If I'd known he would attack a federal agent in broad daylight, I would have fired him myself years ago." "What about the other officers who were arrested?" "Some were just following Morrison's lead, trying to fit in with what they thought was the department culture. Others were actively participating in the corruption for money. We're dealing with each case individually, and the honest officers who testified? They're doing great. Several have been promoted and they're helping train the new recruits. We want everyone to understand that integrity isn't just encouraged here, it's required. After hanging up, with Hayes, James walked to his car, thinking about the lessons learned from this investigation. The most important one was that corruption thrived in darkness, but withered under public scrutiny. Morrison and his associates had operated for years because no one was watching them closely enough. But once their actions were exposed, caught, on camera, witnessed by credible people and prosecuted aggressively, the entire system had to change or be destroyed. James's next assignment in Phoenix would be different, but the principle would be the same. Shine light on corruption, document it carefully, and let justice take its course. As he drove home, James thought about Morrison sitting in his federal prison cell, probably still wondering how a routine harassment of a black traveler had destroyed his career and sent him to prison. The answer was simple. He'd picked on the wrong person at the wrong time, and his victims had finally had someone willing and able to fight back. Morrison had spent 20 years thinking he was untouchable. In the end, he'd learned that no one was above the law, not even corrupt cops who thought they could hide behind their badges. The system wasn't perfect, and there was still work to do in departments across the country. But cases like Morrison sent a clear message to corrupt officers everywhere. Someone is always watching, and justice will eventually find you. James smiled as he drove through the Chicago streets, already planning his next investigation. There were more Morrisons out there, more corrupt departments that needed cleaning up, more innocent people who needed protection. And James would be ready for them.